I'm Marlene Smith-Baranzini. I am a public historian, as they call it. I don't work with a university, and I'm a writer of popular books and mainly history. And I'm also an editor. I jump around between writing and editing. My first work was a series of children's history books, U.S. history, covering the American Indians through the Revolutionary War, or actually, no, through the Civil War. And then my own research is a woman in the California Gold Rush who left a series of letters. This is Dame Shirley, or Louise Clapp. My project with her is a long-term project because I have to work in between and put some food on the table. And so that project is a biography. There has been no biography of Louise Clapp yet, and I'm very interested in her work as a writer and a California woman. I'm currently working on I'm writing and editing a survey history of the Pacific Northwest with an author who is older now, so I am helping him with a lot of the research as well as editing it. So I'm both writer and editor. And my most recent fun project was a travel guide to thoroughbred horse racing in North America. So that involved travel and factual small pieces of writing, but also interesting stories. It's kind of a cultural guide as well as a horse guide. So it covered a span of various kinds of writing, which I had a lot of fun doing. The horse racing book came to me. This was a project that found me, if you will. And I hadn't been to the races at all. I'm very much a novice in the horse racing field. So that made it especially fun for me because I came at it with the enthusiasm of someone who didn't know the subject. So I began by going to local racetracks just to get a feeling for the sport. And the next thing to do, the way to approach it was we decided that this is co-written. My partner on the project is a commercial photographer, so he basically did the photography and guided me in some of the writing and the organization of the book. So we basically began dividing it up, dividing the country up into sections, geographic sections, so that we knew how we were going to proceed. And within each section, of course, there are X number of racetracks. So we began by doing that, and then I worked on the book from that organizational standpoint, writing each section at a time. Although, because horse racing follows a calendar pattern, you go from one track to another. There's a cycle of racing within a region. And to go travel and to visit as many racetracks as possible, I was here, there, and everywhere. And I went to big tracks, small tracks, that kind of thing. So I would go to the racetrack, and while I was there, just do a walkthrough, essentially, write about the track, what it was like, how it felt, the kind of fans who were there. I would find that doing a lot of internet stuff, since this is sort of easy, popular writing. I didn't have to spend long weekends in libraries. I would get good travel guides to suggest what the highlights of a city are, and then maybe go on the internet to get details about a particular museum, that sort of thing. And then when I would get to the city, of course, that's the time when I would actually go to those places, so that it wasn't just I'm writing something third hand. In most cases, I had actually been there, so I could put my personal perspective on it. My approach to keeping track of the information, on that trip, I spoke into a tape recorder. Because at the racetrack, I was wandering around looking at everything, and I wanted to be ready to watch everything go everywhere and not be cumbered with a paper and pencil. So I had a little cassette player that I turned off and on as I needed to. And that way I could simply describe what I saw. It would be much easier to go back to it. And I did that for the cities as well. So I would go through and do that. Then, I'm not trained as a journalist. I was trained as a writer. I was an English teacher at one point, and then I got into writing later. But not being a journalist, I did not go back to my hotel and immediately write my stories. I sort of let things settle, kind of gave myself a little bit of time to see how things settled out and the impressions that I got that I wanted to work with. So I didn't do my writing until I got home. And so it was basically about a year of travel. And then, of course, well, the sidebar stories, I would call them, the little things I wrote up while I was there, But then the actual writing about the racetrack and shaping the story, I would do when I got home and when I was unpacked and maybe between trips for a few days. I would kind of begin to think about, what do I want to say about this track that's different, you know? What is the lead-in so that it's not the same every time, because there are unique features of every track I went to, basically. I had a lot of notes. I had the media guides as one place for getting the facts, because in this book we wanted the facts, how, you know, what's the length of the racetrack and what's this like, what's that like, that sort of thing, the factual things that people want to know about racing. And then, so I had that in the media guides, and then my own notes, my tape recorder, which I would listen to and type from at the computer. And then I did have a notebook. In fact, I had several notebooks, so I would keep the regional things together in a notebook. And that was not a loose leaf, but a bound notebook, so that I would kind of try and stay in order on that. And then, so that's how that project went. I would periodically have a different notebook for each section of the country. And then I kept, for my information on the city part, I used manila folders, and I threw tourist materials in there. Magazine articles, I relied on things like Travel and Leisure to give me some other good ideas. And so those things I threw into a folder that I could just draw from when I was ready to do that writing. And then again, I would end up going back to the internet maybe to do fact checking and that sort of thing. That book, I began as the editor. I began actually as the second editor. It covers the period actually starting with Spain and Portugal and the early sea exploration, the papal line of demarcation dividing the universe basically, or not the universe, but the world into a Spanish half and a Portuguese half. And so Spain gets these water rights and Portugal gets these rights. So it begins at the beginning and it ends chronologically in 1846, by which time the conquest, if you will, of the Pacific Northwest, leaving out the Indians, who were not considered, for various reasons, they were not a political group, but it came down to whose sovereign rights will control the Pacific Northwest. And it had been Spain at one time, and then a little bit France, Russia, the United States, and Britain. And it came down to those two major powers, Great Britain and the United States. And that's how the boundary was divided. So it's a history that covers several centuries. I came in as an editor, and one of the things I always do as an editor is fact check as I go. So that's an important aspect. And for that, I could use the internet, especially now. I think every year the internet is better and better in terms of what's available. And I would make decisions about how reliable a website would be, or any historic site. It's important to know who sponsors it and who the authorities are who have put the material on it. Wikipedia, for example, is a good general place, but if you're relying on that for hard data, you want to make sure that you have confirmed that with other sources, because that's written by anyone who is driven to write information for that part of the internet. And then I, of course, learned the history as I went along. I was familiar with some of it because I had lived in that area. But then as I got into the writing of it and the revising of it, I've had to learn more details. I didn't know any of the political history of the U.S. and Great Britain and the various treaties that set boundaries in the, from 1790 on, actually, with the Spanish and the U.S. and so forth. So I had a lot to learn. And I do that through basically library research. We have a good lending library program here in California. Used to be what they called interlibrary loan, and now some of the systems call it Link Plus, by which you can get books. Almost any book is available from one of the libraries. They aren't all. There are some things I needed on the Columbia River, for example, that I have not been able to get through the library. But that's what I do. So it slows the spontaneity of the work I'm doing, and I try and plan ahead so that when I'm ready for the next chapter, I've got the books there. And to do that, generally I take notes by hand. The first thing I do is go to the index of a book and look at the subject I'm after, write down the page number so I don't have to do that over and over again. And then I just scribble my notes. If I'm quoting something, I have learned to be absolutely precise and verbatim and check it several times, because if there is a misspelling in the original quote and you're questioned by the publisher, You either have to trust yourself and say, yes, that is exactly how it was, or you may have to go back and get the book and get the page number, and that, of course, is not very efficient. So I've learned to be very, very careful and very precise about that. And as I go along, I take notes for future chapters because I'm thinking ahead about the topics that come up. And so I try and do a good job of cross-referencing. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not so good. I have a fairly good photographic memory of where my notes are with a certain page. Again, I work with notebooks generally, and I scribble stuff down. If I'm quoting a passage, I might actually type it into the computer right then, so I have it later. I do a variety of things. I don't have any particular, I don't have a driven system. And I work at home, and sometimes I work from room to room, depending on the season or depending on my mood. Obviously, I have a laptop to be able to do that, but I'm always surrounded by books and papers and, again, manila folders so that I can keep things either topically or by chapter or whatever seems like the most reasonable way to approach it. I don't use loose-leaf notebooks. In my years as an editor with California History, I was always working with manuscripts of, let's say, 30 to 50 pages. So I got used to the idea that you just want to be able to leaf through it and maybe shuffle the pages or turn them sideways, that kind of thing. And I find notebooks too confining. They're not very portable. If I'm going off to work in a library, let's say, I want things to be flat and portable. And the flipping of notebook pages isn't as easy for me. The author that I work with is very different. He wants everything 3-punch hold, and he wants everything in a notebook all the time in order, and that's not the way I work. I shuffle back and forth a lot, so the folders work the best for me. In nonfiction, I think it's absolutely a part of being a writer, even if you're well, with historical writing, or if you're writing today about a place, I think even that kind of writing involves a factual basis for what you're doing. And I always just like to know what came before, whether it's just 10 years ago or whether it's 2 centuries ago. I just like the foundation. So I think research is essential to any of it. And certainly fact-checking, if you're writing about a topic, there's a lot that you need to know. I couldn't go very far without my thesaurus, because for me, writing the same subject and being immersed in it, there's a certain kind of gelatinous thing that happens to the brain, and there are a few words, and that's your life. There's a mold that you end up fitting into, and so the thesaurus is an inspiration. It really is that really precise word that you're too brain dead to come up with. So that's really my Bible, more than the dictionary. You know, I'll use the dictionary to make sure that I've got the right word. I make sure that I am right, but then I just need the inspiration of a variety of ways of looking at a word or a concept. I like to think that I'm getting a little wiser and better organized about my research. I think I come into a project now with the big picture rather than the little picture. And
how do you get that?
a story, well, the way that this came about, the first writing project I had was this series of children's history books, and therefore middle school and actually high school reading level also, but they're geared for young children, basically. And so it's about a 90-page book with a lot of illustrations and a lot of activities. And I co-authored these, so they don't require a lot of text. But we began with the book of the American Revolution. And this was my first project, and it's history, and I didn't know history then as well as I do now. So I went off to the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley to begin my research on the American Revolution. So I'm in a library that is all primary materials, and I'm taking copious notes from old books, rare books. And I really don't need to know everything that's ever been written about the Revolution. I need to pull out some good stories. I need the structure of the war and the rebellion and so forth, but I need good stories for kids. And then we would do timelines to fill in the history, because obviously children don't need a comprehensive history. So I learned later in the, excuse me, the next books that came along, I learned to get a good, reliable history of that period. And and get familiar with the history. And while I was reading, go for the stories that had a human interest angle, so that I would come back to those and then tell that in a way that kids would find it interesting. Because children tend to have a wonderfully narrow focus on what intrigues them. For example, little boys and weapons. You know, at one of my book signing, the only little boy, the only person who came, aside from 2 friends, was a young man who is just so into Civil War rifles. And he could tell me things I didn't know, but he wanted to hear about the rifles, the muskets, and the cannons and that sort of thing. And so that's the kind of object and the sort of focus that you want when you're thinking about what will appeal to a child, to get them interested. It's the people, it's the setting, or it's the action. Mm-hmm. And then as I progressed, the next book I did was the Gold Rush book, and I edited the letters. These are letters from the Gold Rush period, 1851, 1852. But this was a woman who was a school teacher, and I believe the typesetter is the one, because her letters went into a San Francisco newspaper in 1854. So there are a lot of typesetting errors that were not her errors. Although Louise Clapp was not a perfect speller, she wouldn't misspell a simple word, and she wouldn't dyslexify a word. And if she did, you'd want to correct it for the reader anyway. So I decided to take that approach and lightly edit the letters. And then the introduction is the part that I contributed myself, which is a current look at what we know about her life as far as I've been able to take the research. So that was the new editing. Also adding a map of the places she went for a modern reader, because the way the land has changed, of course. I just wanted people who like to travel and see, well, where was she and that sort of thing, to give them some signposts and some guideposts along the way. And for that book, I also added an index, and I'm not an indexer, but through my working with the Shirley letters and giving talks about Dame Shirley and writing other things about her, it was easy because I made my own index as I went along. And of course, my index had a different focus than another person's might. I'm very nature-based, and I was interested in her literary aspect, and a lot of wonderful allusions in the Shirley letters, and a wonderful sense of humor. And so those were the things that I was more concerned about, rather than the gold mining itself. Earlier historians who had worked with the Shirley letters focused on how much gold and how long the sloughs were and what the season was like, and other things that were not. My interest was much more a social interest in a woman and the times. So my approach to that was different. I personally love research. I'm interested in details about things. I've been told that sometimes I'm a little too in love with details. But I think a historian, at some level, you do want details. You want facts and places and when it happened. And so it's important to me. And I also like the sense of how something happened. What were the background incidents that led to something happening? So I'm very interested in those. And then at some personal level, I just find that important. And then the people who are involved, you know, the historical figures, the details of their lives, I think, make a much more interesting story than if it is simply facts and concepts. So that's one approach. I'm just sort of bookish, I guess, in the sense that I'm very at home in the library. I seem to be very at home taking endless notes and building great paper files, but that's my style. So I do enjoy doing it. I love research, and I like putting it together. And I think what's fun about it, when it's my own writing, then I have all the information, and then I realize now, as I've written for several years, that it's fun to tell the story the way I want to, that it really is literature. And I didn't used to think of it as literature, I guess. I used to think of nonfiction as sort of a journalistic thing. But prose can be beautiful. Prose can be very captivating. It can be very rich, very visual. And to create it in such a way that you treat it the way a novelist would, that there are tension points in the writing, and you want to hook the reader, you want to draw them in. You certainly want to share your passion so that they feel that. And so those are the things about the writing I love, when it's actually the lump of clay, you've got the clay now, and now you can shape it any way you want to. And that's fun. And I would say one of my downfalls as a writer is that I've also got the editor's critic in my head at the same time. So I like the idea that I would write a sentence and it would be finished and it would be good. And I try to do a rough draft, do a quick draft, get the ideas down, and then go back and shape things. But a lot of times I just want to pick it, you know, I'm using the past tense, and then I'm using, you know, a little conditional, and then I'm playing around with a sentence, which is not as efficient, but it's kind of the way I do it, and I think it's the way a lot of writers actually do it. There's a certain perfectionism, I think, among writers, but it can be very inefficient. It can be very time-consuming, and if you're on a paid job, it is not efficient to do it that way. I like research in general. I like everything about research. I think with this Pacific Northwest history, some of it is very involved, and especially being in the area, let's say, of U.S. and British politics, where you have national leaders, you've got ambassadors, foreign secretaries, and that sort of thing. And if I'm not familiar with them, occasionally that gets tedious. But usually somewhere along the way, I get clicked into these men as people, the kind of decisions they're making, and how it does affect the outcome of history. And once I've personalized it, then I'm fine again. But if I'm sitting at home and I've got 27 library books on the floor and I would like to get through them and get them back and clear the space, that can be very frustrating. And then of course there are times just when day after day it's a project that I'm not getting much relief from. Sometimes I simply need to take a break, as anybody does in any job, but I tend to be a little driven, so it's not very easy for me to say it's time to stop for lunch, or, you know, it's dinner time now, everybody else has left the office, you should, you know, go in the living room, something like that. But in general, I enjoy doing it, and so, you know, it works out well for the project. One thing I would say, I knew from probably middle elementary school that writing was my passion. But I didn't, of course, know when I was 8 or 9 or 10 what that would mean. I didn't, and it was nonfiction. I never really was one to make up stories, but I liked to write what I saw, where I was, then keep track of my own life, you know, the diary, that kind of thing. And it wasn't until after college that I even recognized that I could go into writing as a profession. This came after I went into teaching. I became an English teacher, and then I worked in places where my writing skills were valued on the job, so I produced newsletters and that kind of thing. And then eventually I looked at my life and I said, well, when you're sitting in that rocking chair as an old lady, what did you do that you loved? What was it about your life that you loved? And that was my choice point in my life. That was when I said I was a writer, and then I said, then I better get going on it, because I've only got X number of years, and I either make it or I don't make it, but I get busy and do it. So I would say to anyone who knows that they're a writer, on whatever level, don't give up, never give up. Affiliate with writers, go to writing groups, you know, hang out, read, and just immerse yourself in it, because opportunities will come to you. I believe this, you know, that if you believe you really want something and you go where that energy is, I believe you can make it happen. And that would be my advice. Never give up, and don't wait too long.